Welcome to AngularJS services tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll go through what are services and how to create and register services in AngularJS. And we'll also go through different ways of how to create and register services. So what are services? Services in AngularJS provides us way to preserve and access data across the lifetime of the Angular application. And this would actually enable us to communicate data across different controllers in a consistent way. And in AngularJS, every service is actually a singleton object, and it gets instantiated only once per application. So any component which is actually dependent on a service gets a reference to that single instance generated by the service factory. In AngularJS, services are lazily instantiated, which actually means that Angular only instantiates a service when an application component actually depends on it. So you can actually use services to organize and share code across the application. And in Angular, services are substitutable objects which are actually wired together using dependency injection. And when you first get started with Angular, you might naturally find yourself placing unnecessary logic in controllers and scopes. It's important to realize that your controller should be very thin, which basically means that most of the business logic and persistent data in your application should be taken care of by a service instead. For memory purposes, controllers are instantiated only when they are needed, and those instantiated controllers can be discarded when they are not needed. So because of this, every time you switch a route or even reload a page, Angular cleans up the current controllers. So services are the way how you could actually provide a means for keeping data around for the lifetime of the application, while they can also be used across different controllers in a consistent manner. So we shall quickly go through different ways of how to create and register our own services. So the first approach is using factory method. This approach is the most popular way to create and configure a service. In this approach, you would just create an object, add properties to it, and then return that same object. Then when you pass the factory into your controller, those properties on the returned object will now be available in that controller through your factory. And the second approach is using service method. The biggest thing to understand when creating a service is just the way how a typical JavaScript object is created using the new keyword. So if you actually see through the example in the following slide, you could just recognize that you will be attaching your properties and methods directly to this keyword, which will then be returned from the service itself. So in this way, services are almost identical to factories in Angular. And the third approach is actually using a provider method. And here the biggest thing to remember about providers is that they are the only service that you can pass into the app.config portion of your application. So this is of huge importance because if you're actually needing to alter some portion of your service object before it's even available anywhere else in your application, you could actually use this approach. Although very similar to services or factories, there are still subtle differences which we could go through in following examples. So here you could actually see how a service can be created and registered using a factory approach. So here the key differences you could notice are app.factory is the method which actually enables to create a service, and so with the here we are particularly using the service name to be my factory, and you could actually see uh, you are actually creating a new service object here as a new JavaScript object within this factory method, and you are also assigning a function to that particular service object, and this actually returns the underscore person value. And when you see towards the end of the code, you are just returning this service object alone through this factory. So when you are trying to access a person variable within the scope context, you are trying to assign myFactory.getPerson. So this would be nothing but accessing service.getPerson. So this is how you are trying to create and register a service using factory approach. So let's go to the service approach. So in this service approach, you could compare the highlighted parts quickly so as to find the differences between the previous approach. So here instead of app.factory, we are actually using app.service and with the service name to be my service. And here instead of having a new JavaScript object created internally, this itself is the object which would be accessible when you actually register this service to controller. So instead of having a different service variable here and assigning a function to that, you could actually assign the function directly to this keyword. So here it would be like this dot get person would be returning the return underscore person value. So when you're actually trying to access this within the controller, uh, it would be my service dot get person. This would be nothing but the this dot get person here directly. So these are the subtle differences when you try to compare the factory and service approach. And we could also see an example here for provider approach. Here again, coming to the commonality, it's instead of using factory or service method, here we are actually using the app.provider method similarly and naming it with my provider service name. And here similarly we are defining underscore person value, and for the demonstration sake we actually added a separate variable which is actually accessible at the entire object level here. So this is value from config, and if you actually see a new section is added at the bottom of the code, which is app.config. So this is where we could actually configure module wise configurations even for the services even before those are available to within the application. So here particularly when you see this value from config is actually being set to this value is set in config here. So when any controller tries to access this provider's particular variables, so you could actually see this being overridden particularly with this value from the config section. And one other key importance here is not the entire section would be available to controller here. So if you notice, there's a highlighted part here which says this dot dollar get. So this is the only section which enables the controller to access. So this is actually returning get person and value on config, and get person would be similarly the underscore person value just like in the other two examples which we saw before. And here value on config would be the variable which actually points to the value from config value which is being overridden in app.config section. So finally, when you try to use this particular two uh, members, so here you are actually setting for the person scope context the call using my provider.get person, which would be the value corresponding to this. And similarly, when you are trying to use value from config within the scope context, when you are actually trying to access my provider dot value on config, this would be nothing but the final value which is actually being set here in app.config section. So this is how you could actually create and register services using different approaches. Thanks for watching.